So we're delighted to have you here tonight for the second event of Origins and Legacies, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, a project developed by the Linden Hall team to mark the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. This agreement was the product of talks and negotiations between politicians and community activists locally, nationally and internationally. At this event tonight, we have some of the 1998 negotiators from across the political spectrum to share their insights. On behalf of the Linden Hall, I would like to give a warm welcome to our panellists and to the chair of this event, Mark Simpson, who reported on events as they unfolded, and to thank the National Lottery Heritage Fund for supporting this project. You will have seen our exhibition on the way in. It's going to be there for April and May, and we'd like to thank Oma Museum and Northern Ireland Screen for supporting that as well. I would like to personally thank Melissa Bird, the curator, supported by Samantha and Annie, for their work. And just a wee bit of a sales pitch from us. We're doing a fundraiser for the library with Adrian Dunbar on the 10th of May in Belfast City Hall. So please check that out on our website as well. Thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to Mark now.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to everyone at Linden Hall for all that you do. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to look around the audience and see so many familiar faces on stage and off stage. I often say that people ask the question, what is our national sport here? And I say it's politics. I mean, it's a Friday night, you could be doing anything, but you're here. You can all decide where the boundaries are on that nation, and maybe we'll come into that later on. If you keep the doors open, some people may want to leave, because if you came here tonight thinking we're going to talk about the agreement, in a way we're not. Sorry to everybody who's watching online. Tonight is strictly about the origins of the agreement. As Julie said, I was outside for 2 years. The negotiations actually began in June 1996. I was there outside, and to be honest, I hadn't much of a clue what was going on inside. These lovely people talked to me quite a lot, but they didn't tell me an awful lot. Gary McMichael, it's lovely to see you. Monica McWilliams, lovely to see you. I used to know you as Peter Weir. It's Lord Weir, congratulations. Bríd Rodgers, wonderful to see you again. A bit like Mitchel McLaughlin, you have retired from the political scene. Mitchel McLaughlin, lovely to see you. We have a couple of questions that we're going to keep the answers quite brief because we want to get to you, the audience. We're going to finish maybe shortly after 7 o'clock, and somebody feel free to come up and tap me on the shoulder if by 6:45 we haven't come to you and heard your questions. Gary McMichael, before I ask you a proper question, you were the leader of the UDP, the Loyalist UDP, which was seen as the political wing of the UDA. You were an independent councillor in Lisburn. You were there on Good Friday. You left the political stage in 2005, and I often thought when I saw you beside David Irvine that of the two kind of most prominent loyalist politicians, you were maybe a reluctant politician. Was I right?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I mean, I kind of got brought into politics because of circumstances.
Your dad?
Because my dad was killed in '87, I kind of felt that, what he was trying to do at that point, which was to, create a dialogue around how do we move beyond the conflict, was something that, needed to be picked up again. So that's what kind of brought me into it. And then kind of, I suppose, ended up being thrust, finding myself then in that kind of, leadership position, which is not where I had.
No.
I've always want to say anybody who actually wants to be a politician shouldn't be allowed to be one. But the circumstances, I think, sometimes bring you into that position.
Monica McWilliams, maybe a slightly similar story with you, that you've been involved in politics, maybe with a small p, all of your life. You're a professor in academia, you're still on the Independent Reporting Commission, you're still involved in politics as such, but all of a sudden, back in 1996, you co-founded the Women's Coalition and got into elected politics.
Yeah, and strangely enough, it was the two Conservative women, Jane Denton and Lady Mayhew, who after the Downing Street Declaration felt that there hadn't been a big enough response from the women in Northern Ireland. And I was at the university, and they wrote and asked if I would organise a conference. And I said, well, it would have to be outside Belfast because everything normally happens in Belfast if you want it for the whole of Northern Ireland. And I couldn't believe the response. We bussed people in from everywhere. It was a lot of hard work because if you remember at the time, there was a lot of tension, even amongst women, about whether they would come to something organised by the establishment.
Yes.
And probably that's why they came to the university. That conference gave me a taste of what people wanted. And I said, well, if there's peace talks declared, should we lobby the other parties to put women at the table? Or should we get organised? It's kind of sowed the seeds. Little did we know that about 2 years later, that question would be asked in reality. So we were accidental politicians. And I have to say, Mark, the question was asked, do you want blood on your hands? Because that's what you're going to have if you go into politics. You're much better staying in the community and doing the work that women are known for across the divide and the peace lines. And I thought, no, if you have to be inside, this is the one opportunity. And with obviously two governments, those parties that had affiliations to those who had been combatants were going to be at the table. And I felt civil society needed to be there as well. So we fell into it.
Thank you, Monica. Peter Weir, can I call you a career politician? You were one of the... Are you going to object to that? Well, yeah, so, baby barrister...
Sorry, I'm the DUP. This is the first walkout of the evening. At this point on it, Mark.
Well, we're 25 years since the last one, almost to the day. So, obviously, you were one of the baby barristers back in the early 1990s in the Ulster Unionist Party, which was then the largest party with 10 MPs out of 18. You were there almost every day. There were negotiations at Castle Buildings. For people who don't know, you disagreed with the agreement. You were part of the delegation that left on the final day, or didn't go up to the plenary. You then later, I think in 2002, joined the DUP. You became Education Minister in the new Assembly. You were elected to the Assembly both in North Down and Strangford, and you're now in the House of Lords. Quite a CV. Just so that we deal with it now, can you tell us why 25 years ago you couldn't sign up to the agreement?
Well, Mark, I suppose we'll be getting into this probably in depth. I suppose principally the issues around decommissioning, around prison releases, and probably to a lesser extent the police issue, where I felt that there were bridges too far. I mean, I suppose just I would say the talks were very much a formative experience for me, because although I'd been involved in politics at an activist level, it was the first time I was there as an elected representative. I was there as a junior member of the Ulster Unionist Talks team, and I can remember, if I can maybe say one very short anecdote, that I remember on one occasion we had a request in from the Irish government to meet, and there was only myself and one other very junior member that was left, and we were ushered up to meet Dick Spring, who was then the foreign minister. And have you ever any of the experience of entering a room where somebody is kind of looking through you to see, is there somebody more important about to come in behind them?
Yes.
But we had the meeting, and then curiously enough, I think possibly the Sunday afterwards, there was a piece in one of the papers which said that the Irish foreign minister had been a bit annoyed he'd been left for the Ulster Unionist C team. I was very, very proud to have made it up to the level C at that stage.
Bríd Rodgers, you were very much in the A team with the SDLP, working very closely with John Hume. And Seamus Mallon, who I think was maybe did a lot of the heavy negotiating, is that right? Later then, of course, elected to the Assembly and became Agriculture Minister and really made your name during one of the first crises at Stormont, which was nothing to do with the politics, which was foot and mouth. So, Bríd, just tell us a little bit just about your experience as a senior negotiator in there in the second largest party.
Well, Gary was saying that he was a reluctant politician. I have to say I was an accidental politician, because I started with the Campaign for Social Justice in 1964. That's how old I am. And then I moved on to Civil Rights Association because I realised that we had to have statistics to prove the problems in Northern Ireland. And anyway, a very long story short, coming from Donegal into Northern Ireland was quite a culture shock when I saw the situation for Catholic nationalists, whatever you like to call them. However, I never intended to go into politics, and something was happening after the civil rights campaign faltered or fell apart. And I rang John Hume one day and I said, John, there's something going on in Lurgan, I don't like it. I had opted out at that stage. And I said, what are you lot doing about it? And he said, what are you doing about it? And that was that. So I joined. So then I became...
Similar to Monica's story as well.
Yeah. Well, I then became involved, and that was back in what, God knows, it was back in the late 60s, early 70s. So I went on from that and went through a lot of failed negotiations, one way or another, in different places from here to England and everywhere else, in grand houses. But I found I was worried about all the negotiations. We got a lot of help. We were in South Africa twice. We got help from a lot of people who wanted to help us. But I think that when it came to the Good Friday Agreement, it was the first time that we had an inclusive agreement with everybody at the table, which I thought was hopeful, although it was going to be difficult because of the background. We were working in a background where, you know, relations had been poisoned. And it was intriguing, really, to see. And if it hadn't been for Senator Mitchell, I think we might still be there negotiating. But anyway, so it was a very difficult time, fraught, a lot of huge issues to be resolved. When I look at the problems to be resolved now, I mean, I think it's like tiddlywinks. So anyway, I found it interesting but difficult.
Yes.
And we had difficulties, particularly in the Strand 1, where Sinn Féin weren't involved. They didn't believe in an assembly, so we were negotiating with the Ulster Unionists, and it was a difficult negotiation because Trimble had serious difficulties with the Alliance Party, I think, wanted voluntary coalition, but we knew that wouldn't work because that would cut out some of the other parties. So,
we will get into all of this, Bríd, I promise you. Just answer one quick question. Would you have regarded Peter Weir walking into the room as the Ulster Unionist C team or not?
Please promote me at least to a C.
when he was an Ulster Unionist.
Yes. Would you have regarded him as the C team or maybe? I would have regarded him as the B team, in fairness.
Well, actually, to be honest, I really didn't know.
Right. Peter who? Peter who?
Sorry about that.
Right. We'll cut that bit out of the video.
I had dealt more with the Paisleys of this party.
Mitchel McLaughlin, Mr. Speaker. My goodness. Who would have thought that MLA then became the Speaker of the Assembly? Though I have to say, like from a journalistic point of view, Mitchel McLaughlin, you probably did more press conferences in 1996, 1997 and 1998 than any other member of Sinn Féin, including Gerry Adams or Martin McGuinness. You were seen as the firefighter during times of crisis. Is that fair?
Stephen Grummelson christened me as being in charge of unexploded interviews, which I thought didn't really explain the complexities of the brief. But yes, I was the point person in terms of the media, and the media was a very important consideration for us, being a party that had been subjected to all forms of very imaginative censorship, including some self-censorship. But the issue about the origins of the peace process.
Yes.
I mean, my own very clear kind of view is that there was an early kind of peace process, which was the peaceful civil rights movement, and I was part of that, and I was at the march in Derry that was battened off the streets, and that kind of peace process really was for very modest kind of demands. It was for the right to vote, the right not to be discriminated, the right to housing, and the right to employment opportunities. But even that was an unacceptable demand, and it's a matter of history now. It was banned and then attacked by the RUC. And it was one of those kind of issues that acted as a catalyst for what then began to rapidly escalate into street confrontations and beyond that into armed confrontations. But the peace process that delivered on the Good Friday Agreement actually came out of the horrific, the tragic kind of year of the hunger strikes, 1981, and the mass mobilisations, not just throughout Ireland, north and south, but internationally. And for Sinn Féin, and I was a member of the leadership of Sinn Féin at that stage, they realised that there was a popular support for the demands for self-determination in Ireland, and certainly for the circumstances of the hunger strike itself. And as you know, hunger strikers, Bobby Stans was offered up as a candidate, was elected. Kieran Doherty and Paddy Agnew were also elected to Leinster House. That, I think, started a process in Sinn Féin, which resulted in peace proposals, the first of them in 1982, the Scenario for Peace, and a subsequent one which came about 8 years later, towards a lasting peace in Ireland. So out of the tragedy and the agony of the hunger strike, the seeds of Sinn Féin's analysis and awareness that there was popular support out there for a strategy for reunification, but that it had to be a negotiation between all of the traditions on the island, and it had to be one that would continue to kind of build on that initial support.
Quick fire round. A week before Good Friday, if I had been asking each one of you, would you have said there is definitely going to be a deal? Mitchel McLaughlin?
No, I didn't think there was going to be a deal at that stage, but I did think there was going to be a deal eventually.
Bríd?
I was worried. I thought it was going to be the same old, you know.
Another glorious feeling?
Ravelling at the very end.
Okay. Peter Weir?
I thought it was probably very unlikely, because I think it might have been, you get a little bit confused in terms of time frame, but I think the first final document, I think, was produced roughly about a week before, and yes. I felt that the gap, certainly from a union's point of view, between what was there and what could reach a deal was far too big in that regard. So I thought a deal was unlikely but not impossible. Mm-hmm.
Monica?
I remember thinking that the people were desperate for it and going out and trying my best not to sound like Pollyanna, but also trying to keep optimism high, because if the people pushed, then we might respond. And I remember seeing the first draft. We were meant to get it that Friday night, and Mitchell took the hit and said that it was his fault. It wasn't. Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern were back in London trying to sort it out. And when it came, I remember saying, no one is going back to war over what's in this document. So in a way, I had incredible belief that if we didn't, it was an opportunity that wasn't going to come around anytime soon, and we needed to be serious about it. And I got the sense, because I was talking to every party, that every party was desperate to get it over the line. And every party had their issues, terrible, difficult issues, to bring their constituents with them to do that. So, Mark, on that Friday night, exactly a week before, I would say none of us knew whether we would eventually get there. But there was incredible hope. And through Senator Mitchell, we felt, maybe we'll do it.
Thank you. Gary?
Well, I think whenever Mitchell set a deadline, we're at a point where it looked like it would just be totally impossible, because you've been there for a year and a half, and you know there hadn't been any kind of stage where it was stable, or that it looked like we're in the end phase. So setting a deadline seemed to be actually, you know, guaranteeing failure in this, I think. Whenever we saw the initial document, I kind of felt that it was in the right kind of shape, but that this didn't have the detail, and certainly didn't see how it would be enough to keep everybody on board. So, you know, you were going into that phase. I think everybody's actually saying the same thing. Nobody was really thinking that this is just about dotting the I's and crossing the T's. It wasn't. It was there was a skeleton of a deal, and I think that, as Peter's saying, you know, that there were significant, you know, parts to it that had the risk of just throwing one side or the other just totally off board.
Let me ask you to take a slightly broader perspective and ask you the same question again the other way round. What was it about that week that created the deal, whether you liked it or not? Starting with you, Gary, what was the significant factor? We're talking about the origins of the agreement. We have historians in the room tonight. You know, if they want to say there was a turning point that week, there was a person that week, there was a clause in that agreement that I said we wouldn't talk about that turned the page, what would it be, Gary?
Well, for me, I think that there was, in the last few days, what you had was that there was, it got down into what appeared to be detailed negotiations around some of the details around the bits that were causing the most problems for people. For us, it wasn't so bad, I thought, because I thought that the core issues from a unionist perspective, from a loyalist perspective, maybe rather, were being dealt with.
Consent.
Yeah, and the Articles 2 and 3.
Articles
you
2
know,
and
the totality of relationships, dealing with a conflict resolution as well as a political framework.
Prisoners.
Yeah, but with enough pain and enough gain around it all in order for it to have the right shape. I think that the difficulty was those things which, you know, which unionism generally felt most uncomfortable about probably wasn't so much actually the constitutional issues. I thought those had been reasonably well kind of locked in. It was around those emotional issues around, you know, around security and policing and prisoners and those things, and decommissioning. And, you know, and we were on some of those things, we were on the wrong side of the argument for much of unionism, you know, because those were things we were interested in as well. But, you know, I think that it was as good as it was going to get within the time frame. I would say I've got regrets about all of that, because I think that...
That's my last question. Don't go there. I'm going to ask you all at the end if there's one more thing that you would have put into the agreement. What was it? Hold that thought, Gary. Monica, what made it that week?
Well, it's a very difficult process because nothing was agreed until everything was agreed. And everything wasn't.
We should have been playing Storm
agreed.
and Bingo tonight, and that would have been there. Nothing is agreed till everything.
Everything is agreed, and that mantra will never leave me.
Yes.
Because what was everything? It was everything. The policing people were running in one corridor, the prisoner people were downstairs, human rights people were flying on the phone and ringing in and telling us that there isn't enough in this. The constitutional issues, we were leaving quite a bit of that, as Bríd just said, in terms of Strand 1 to the Ulster Unionists and SDLP, but you still wanted to hear how that was carving out. The two governments were taking charge of Strands 2 and 3, but you still, as I say to this day, it's the keepers of the pen. In our case, it was the keepers of the computer disk, because everything was on a laptop. And if you remember, we were trying to see the written amendments, because things were getting amended, but we had no paper in front of us. So you had to go literally and sit outside the door of the person that was in charge and find out who was in charge of that particular paragraph. And I remember sitting for hours that night outside the door of the policing people and saying the words international needs to be in front of the words independent commission in terms of the reform of policing. Because I felt if international is not in there, we've had so many commissions before, but they haven't been seen to be truly independent. One word makes a difference. And so we were constantly looking at that. We had a flip chart up in our office, and we had written down the north-south bodies. They were very complicated to follow because it was coming down to the wire about whether these would be executive bodies. In the end, they became implementation bodies, interdependent with the Assembly. And I remember Martin McGuinness crossing our door at one stage late that night, and he saw we had still 6 issues, because we had our own issues, the Civic Forum, we had the issues of integrated education, the issues of resources for young people in the future, shared living, shared housing. And we had a flip chart, and we had still realised we have to work these out. We were like a group of teachers in the room, talking to each other. And Martin McGuinness comes past the door and he says, "You've only 6 things?" He says, "We've 66. I says, "Away, we've a couple of hours left." And the most important thing I learned that night was to draft a solution to a problem.
Yes.
Because you cannot go around at that late stage bringing problems without knowing what the answer might look like. So we were drafting and drafting and drafting, not knowing if any of it was going to be accepted, but making sure that both sets of officials on the British and Irish government side who were doing the actual technical work would actually have a sheet in front of them of what we thought might be the alternative to the problem that had arisen.
Gotcha. You've taken us back there, Monica. You've taken us back, and we can feel as if we were in the room. Peter?
I'm probably going to have therapy after this. Yeah, look, I suppose the analogy I would use a little bit, the last week, maybe the last fortnight, were fairly hectic. And I suppose if there was going to be, whether successfully or not, a real push for an agreement, it was always going to be hectic. What it kind of reminded me of, because, I mean, this was, if you like, it was the last week where the negotiations took place in a 2-year process. And I don't know if you ever watch in the Olympics where there's one of the cycling events with the sprint, where it's 2 competitors and it's maybe 4 laps.
Cat and mouse.
And for the first 3 laps, they're maybe just edging along at an incredibly slow pace, kind of cat and mouse watching each other. And then one of them makes a break for it and they both try and race to the line. That was always quite likely to be the case if there was a genuine attempt to reach an agreement. Now, there could have been a judgment call, particularly by the British and Irish government, that really the chances were negligible and they could have effectively pulled up stumps in that regard, if I'm mixing sort of sporting metaphors here. So it was always going to be very intense at the close of play. I think arguably if there was a turning point, because I think it probably showed, I think on 2 grounds, it showed perhaps there was that level of commitment to find a complete solution. And also I think, and I know this maybe strays into one of the other likely topics in terms of the personalities.
Yes.
I think probably the arrival of Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern was critical, because it showed, if you like, that it wasn't just the government's going through the motions of, well, you know, we've tried, these terrible natives can't reach an agreement type of thing. It was a sign of real commitment on that basis. And I think, again, without straying into things, probably where there might have been a tension between party and government, particularly from an Ulster Unionist point of view, wasn't a great relationship, I think, between the Ulster Unionist Party and the Department of Foreign Affairs. There was probably a bit of a cool relationship between David Trimble and Mo Mowlam. But you then had a situation where Bertie Ahern, who was, I think, the consummate negotiator, and somebody I think, certainly with hindsight, both at the time, was seen as somebody who gave his full commitment. Tony Blair came, I think, was seen almost to be then, you know, you were bringing in the Galactico. I'm bringing a third analogy into this on it, into it. And I suppose, particularly I suppose with Tony Blair, I mean, this was, call it early Blair. It was the bit where he still had the sheen of the 97 election. You know, whether Tony Blair would have quite the level of credibility if it had been 5 or 6 years down the line might be questionable. But I think, I would say, if anything, that was probably particularly from a moment's point of view, the game changer, and the fact that I think for both of them, they were willing to get down to the gritty detail and, I suppose, see what was needed to reach an agreement. Now, you know, again, there'll be divergence on whether it was the right agreement in that regard, but
yes,
clearly there was a level of commitment that was there.
I have another question about David Trimble, which I'll come back to you with in a moment, Peter. Bríd Rodgers, what was the turning point for you that week?
I think that the turning point for me was when Seamus Mallon came down from a very tough negotiation to tell us that we had got agreement on how the power sharing assembly would work, and that had been a very tough negotiation, because getting the right guarantees into it to make sure that there would not be a majority unionist against a nationalist community was very difficult. And when he broke that, I thought, well, that's strand 1 sorted anyway, you know, so let's hope we get through the others. But I think the big thing...
Sorry, was that when the hug took place?
I think it was.
Was it? Okay.
I think it was. But, you know, the reality was we all had difficult constituencies. I think Trimble had the most difficult constituency of all to deal with. But the people were desperate for peace, and we all the parties knew that. People just wanted the violence to end. And I think nobody wanted to be seen to have spoilt this last chance. And I think that's what actually helped in the end. And also the fact that Bertie Ahern, and the Dublin government and Blair were actually committed to making it happen. I had seen other negotiations where I felt, you know, when it unravelled, you know, the 2 governments went out and they made kind of statements and we'll keep going. But they didn't want to go out with a failure.
No.
And I felt, well, we've got the first strand now, and surely the others, which really wasn't the strand, the north-south was difficult for us, but the most difficult one, of course, was the prisoners and decommissioning, and they were really, really difficult issues.
Thanks, Bríd. Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, my clear recollection is that we had come to a conclusion as we approached the deadline that we weren't going to be able to square all of those issues away, and that was that was actually the considered view of the party. But we had felt that we had made sufficient progress, nonetheless, across the piece, that there was plenty to kind of pick up again. So this is on the back of long and unremitting struggle, and you know, maybe modest expectations that we were going to kind of square all of that away, and that everything was going to be hunky dory. What we found in terms of those last 2 days in particular is that the two loyalist delegations and ourselves were, you know, developing a better understanding, and the Women's Coalition had been, you know, very kind of positive and optimistic, I think, throughout in terms of I suppose the responses they were getting and the reaction, the public reaction. So, you know, I mean, I was asked questions about the 7 o'clock Thursday evening interview I had given, where in fact our conclusion was that we weren't going to get a deal on this occasion, and my job was to kind of lower expectations and the impact of a negative outcome, and we then worked throughout the rest of that evening. And I remember this quite distinctly. Then the process of going through our checklist, we didn't have the boards. Martin was telling the truth there. We had too many issues and not enough boards.
Not a big enough board.
Not enough. There wasn't enough boards in the entire building. So, but we did actually at the end of the day. And one of the things that influenced us most was Davy Irvine put the point in relation to the prisoners issue, which was a very difficult and a common issue between us. Where we were arguing the difference between 3 years of a release kind of process for the prisoners. We were arguing for 1 year. And Davy made the point that, you know, you can push the 1 year deal. It would drive David Trimble out of the talks. And it was at that point that Martin McGuinness came back to our review session to say that this was an issue in which we had to kind of accept that we weren't going to get the 1 year deal. We eventually ended up with within a 2 year period, and that was honoured, and it turned out to be controversial internally, and particularly with the prisoners' families, because they were expecting more. But we were able to kind of deliver the support of those families, which was crucial. In the briefings and the town hall meetings that we then engaged in. So we had decided by 4:30 that morning that was as much as we were going to get, and it was also sufficient for us to go back to the party leadership, because it involved changes in policy in relation to the elected assembly. And we said that we thought we had a deal that we could make work at 7 o'clock that morning, and that's when the balloon went up.
The rest is history. Before I open this to the floor, we've talked about politics. I want to talk about personalities. And Monica, you've talked at length about relationships. How important were personal relationships, just between individual party members? So interesting to hear Mitchel McLaughlin. You're sitting over there because I thought that you would object to me saying this. There was the impression, I'm being honest here, outside, that the Women's Coalition maybe weren't as big an influence inside as they were saying. But you know what? Yes.
Yeah, sure do. You made it very clear to us that we weren't. Absolutely, we had to fight every inch to get a little bit of coverage, maybe a sentence or two. There was somebody in every party, Mark, that you could relate to.
Yes.
And I actually thought Davy Adams and yourself played an incredible role. Very good chemistry, good relationship, friendship. There was friendship. And you've heard me talk about David Irvine. And this afternoon I went to see the exhibition in University of Ulster, and David is almost in the room. There's a big kind of video of him when he was, it must have been done in 2003, and I actually shed a tear when I looked at it because his presence was so strong, I felt it. And that's how I felt in those negotiations. He had an incredible charisma and had good friendship with everyone. And I'm sure all of us here would testify to that. So chemistry is everything. You can talk substance all you want, but if you don't sit down and have a good personal relationship with at least one or two people in every party, and we made sure we built that. But Mo Mowlam for me, undoubtedly was incredible. She had taken off her shoes, as Mo often did, and preferred to work in her and run as she was running in her bare feet. Intravenous drip in her arm, no wig, and absolutely working herself into the ground. And what I love about the play and the lyric is it brings back the women's intellect. Because afterwards, too many people talked about her bad language or her behaviour. I loved it. I thought she was a breath of fresh air, actually. As a British Secretary of State, she got it. She got Northern Ireland in a way that nobody else did before it. And I could see it that night. And I'll tell you why it made a difference. I could see how tired she was at 4 o'clock or something in the morning. And back to Sinn Féin. Masters at working somebody into the ground in terms of negotiations. And she thought you're now telling us that at about 4 o'clock the deal was done. But Mo didn't know that. And yet I did, and I've told you this afterwards, because personal relationships come into it. I had taught Pat Doherty's wife, Mary, in McGee. Now there you go. Right? That meant everything. And Pat came and said to me, "It's going to be okay." And I said, "Can I tell Mo this? And please don't have me court-martialed at dawn for now saying something that too late." And I said, "Can I? I mean, Mo just thinks that you're not on board." And he said, "Yeah." And I told Mo, and she gave me a hug, and have you ever imagined running with an intravenous drip where you're going to trip over the wire? And she took off to tell Tony Blair. And she said, "I have to tell the Prime Minister, because this is it." And she disappeared, flying down the corridor. And for that, she'll always be in my memory. She was tremendous.
Bríd, I mean, it's not about gender politics, but you probably were the only woman in the room, apart from the Secretary of State, at some of those bilaterals, with governments. Can you tell us a little bit about relationships there?
Well, I think they were difficult. I must say I found there were some were easier than others. I think David Trimble, with due respect to the horrendous job he had and how brave he was and how courageous, he wasn't easy on relationships. And I think I didn't. maybe that's an understatement. He didn't find it easy, No. He was more of an academic and a constitutionalist, and he knew what needed to be done and he wanted done, but relationships were not his thing really. But for most of the other parties, there was a good relationship. I mean, I was able to chat away to Martin McGuinness and in a way that I wouldn't have had before, because we had all this history between us. I thought that Davy Irvine and Davy Adams and Gary were very, very, it was I saw people that I didn't know before in a different light, if you like. And it was very interesting to see those relationships being built up.
Gary, I was going to use this in a podcast called Red Lines, which I would recommend. And I was going to say it, and then I held back. Was it a little bit like one of those school trips whereby you had your own crowd, and then all of a sudden you're away with people for a few days, and you realise you have a lot, a bit like the Pat Doherty story, you realise you have a lot more in common with the other members of the class than you think you had, or is that just a bit too trite?
Well, I think that regardless of all the individual personalities, and lots of, very different people involved in the whole thing, and some you get closer to than others, and some are more easy to like than others, and that's, well, you know what I mean?
Was there ever a truer word said?
But the reality is that whenever people are spending time
Yeah.
together, the people who were inside the rooms in those processes had better understanding of each other than the people who were outside trying to understand what was going on inside. And for a lot of the time, we were involved in council buildings 3 days a week, and then there's 2 days a week for part of it. You were the forum thing and the centre point, whatever it's called, in Belfast. So basically, it was like a full-time experience.
Yeah.
And it had lots of very, very difficult ups and downs, and it was always difficult. But what you got to understand was the people who were behind it. And when you're dealing with people, that you weren't dealing with a television screen and what's on the television screen. You knew it became easier to know what was the difference between what was posture and what was real.
Yes. You had enough time.
And this wasn't going to work if everybody just took positions. You had to understand what was possible and what was acceptable to everyone. Because I think that for the most part, in the back of everybody's mind, to some extent, there was an understanding that we had to keep as many people as possible in here at the end. And because the more people that couldn't deal with it, the more people who walked it, the less chance was that this could be sold, because the agreement was only one thing. You had to sell it. You couldn't. No point us agreeing on anything if you couldn't sell to people outside.
Well, that's what I want to pick up on, and then I will go to the floor with you, Peter Weir. Sorry to bounce you with this. I should have warned you about this question. Bríd Rodgers talks about David Trimble being that intellectual, academic politician. As we know, there are different types, and you need different types of politician. You need that type of politician in the room that's going to look at the detail and look at things strategically and academically without being the huggy, kissy type. And David Trimble certainly wasn't that. I spoke to somebody else who was in your party at the time recently who said, and unfortunately David Trimble isn't here to defend himself, that they felt David Trimble was always going to do a deal that week. On the Wednesday night, he went to see Blair at Hillsborough Castle. He went on his own, and that one way or the other, if there was a deal on the table, David Trimble was going to sign up to it that week. What do you think?
Well, I think with hindsight, that is probably correct. I think that David Trimble, and I think both his strengths and his weaknesses, and again, it's difficult when you're talking about somebody who's no longer with us, and I appreciate that. I think both his strengths and his weaknesses were, on the one hand, I think he was very academic, very intellectual, very focused on what he felt needed to happen, and so they would have been very much across the level of detail. See, sometimes very senior politicians will be very broad brush, but maybe not get down to the nitty gritty. He would have a very strong sense of the level of detail. What I would say is, and I think then the weakness within that, I suppose, was twofold. First of all, I think he played probably even internally played his cards quite close to his chest on that basis. So I don't think it was apparent. If you'd got a group of Ulster Unionists together and said a week beforehand or a few days beforehand, is David Trimble determined, come what may, to get a solution or to sign up to pretty much anything that's there? Probably a lot of them would have said no. So I think it wasn't altogether apparent in relation to that. I think possibly the other bit where there was one level of weakness was, I think he looked at very much ticking the boxes on some of the constitutional, some of the political structural side of things on it. I think he underestimated the significance across the community, but particularly the unionist community, of, if you maybe detach, I know there's a high level of interlinkage, call it the peace process issues as opposed to the directly political issues. And so I think he underestimated what the impact on people's thinking would be on issues like decommissioning and the prisoner side of things. And I think that's where there was a bit of divergence. What I would say, I suppose, is, even though I disagreed with him politically, there was a high level of both political and personal bravery from what David Trimble was prepared to do. because, even though I suppose we were in a situation where there was a level of peace, for anybody taking a particular position in Northern Ireland, we're always putting themselves and their families at a certain level of risk. And I think within an Ulster Unionist context, it is probably, to the extent that he did, it was probably only David Trimble was the only person that could effectively have pulled it off. And why I say that is, of the other senior figures within the Ulster Unionist Party, I think there's a slight grey area about John Taylor. But if it was a Reg MP or a Ken McGuinness, I don't think they would have gone for it, and did obviously go for it, but probably wouldn't have the credibility to the same extent within the Ulster Unionist Party to be able to carry sufficient numbers of people along with them. And the other senior figures in the Ulster Unionist Party wouldn't have signed the deal. It's only, I think, David Trimble who came from an angle of both signing up to it and at least being able to carry the numbers that he did within unionism towards it.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to open this up to the floor. I don't think it's any coincidence, and Mitchell, I'm sure you would agree, and Bríd as well. The likes of David Trimble no longer with us, Martin McGuinness, John Hume, Seamus Maloney. Those years took their toll. Have we questions? And because we've only got 10 minutes, we will keep it to questions. Maybe take a couple of thoughts from the room. If you want to raise your hand, we've got a yellow. Sorry, go ahead.
We're waiting on the questions.
Yep.
What has struck me is a lot of stuff is coming out now that didn't come out then.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people would not have appreciated just the level of insecurity that people felt, or that the risk they were taking. And that came out later. Gerry Adams said recently, it was only after David Trimble's funeral, that he realised the amount of turmoil and antagonism and actually physical abuse. And the programme on TV, I think last night, showed it. The BBC's, the making of the agreement, where they were physically being attacked.
They were.
And David Irvine always said, the challenge will come from our own side, not from the other side. So that's what I would like to add to this.
Good point.
There was a couple of other names that I want to just name check, and I spoke to her this afternoon, and she wishes everybody here the best, who's Martha Pope.
Martha Pope, yes.
Senator Mitchell's Chief of Staff,
yeah.
who will end up as a footnote. And all of us, I'm sure, would agree that she played a phenomenal role.
Yeah.
And Senator Mitchell quite rightly gets the credit.
Yeah.
But you know what they say, and it's true, behind every man there's a good woman.
Folks, we've only got about 10 minutes left. I hope Martha Pope's watching. I wanted to interview her, and she wouldn't do an interview. Do you see the lovely things that Monica's just said? Please give me an interview. Have we any questions? There we have there, sir.
My question isn't about David Trimble, although I'm going to introduce it using his name. He's described as an academic constitutionalist, but as we saw on Garvaghey Road, he's also an Orangeman, happily dancing along with Paisley. So my question is to the unionists at the time: how much time did they have to spend looking over their shoulder at where the Orange Order was and all of these matters? And that question is still relevant today.
We'll take a couple more questions. Thank you very much indeed. Any more questions? Yes, there we are. Lovely.
The reflections quite understandably embrace all of the events that happened in the past, and the yearning is for the questions about the future and what directions they may take.
Thank you very much indeed. Have we one more? Have we a lady in the audience? No, we have a gentleman with a lovely moustache.
I thought Gary was going to indicate that at this stage he may have had some regrets about what he had signed up to at the time when he was cut short, and I'd appreciate if he could elaborate on what concerns he now has in relation to the agreement.
That's a good point. Let's start there. Yeah.
Okay, well, it wasn't so much about concerns that I had about the agreement. It was about, from our perspective, it was more about we're coming out of a process where you knew that there were a lot of things that were getting kicked down the road, and a lot of those were those, as Peter says, those peace process type sort of things. So decommissioning wasn't nailed. The kind of how we were dealing with the legacy of the Troubles wasn't being nailed. The Bill of Rights was kicked down the road. All of those things. And it was those issues which were about how people felt about each other and their experience of coming out of a conflict.
But would there have been a deal if you'd nailed down those issues, Gary?
Yeah, I know, but my regret is that we weren't able to do that, because I think that a lot of the problems that were experienced in the first 10 years, particularly after the agreement, were all about those unresolved issues. Because the concerns that people had in communities was about what the intentions and sincerity was of the other community, and about how that was in terms of their experience, and how people were still hurt a lot because of what they'd experienced. And so I think that in terms of dealing with if we had had more time, if we had have been able to do that, you talk about the relationships earlier, if the DUP hadn't have walked out a year after the talks started, whenever Sinn Féin walked in, if the IRA hadn't have broken the ceasefire and Sinn Féin had been in from the start, we'd have had a year that together that we didn't have. So, it's like it was a wasted year completely, and because the negotiations only took place in the last 6 months. And I think that time was what was needed in order to have relationships built, or the possibility of relationships built, where maybe some of those issues could have been dealt with better, more completely. And the thing about the Orange Order and all of that there, we had plenty of people to look over our shoulder at, and in concerns of taking this forward. I knew whenever we walked out on Good Friday morning, that we were walking out at a time when probably around half of the people within the unionist community, regardless of what their affiliation was, were saying, we may not like this. And so we were walking out in a very vulnerable position, certainly a lot more vulnerable than what nationalism was. And that's what's plagued that erosion of confidence since day one. Has been a clock working backwards. So it was not an ideal position.
Thanks, Gary. Bríd and Mitchell.
Yes, I have to agree. I think, first of all, just to get back very briefly to David Trimble, I don't think anybody knows how hard he fought to get the thing that he thought would get the unionist agreement. For instance, he was on the North-South bodies. He really, in the end, we argued with him, but in the end, he had to. We had to give him. There was the Council of Ireland was at the back of his mind after Sunningdale, obviously, which brought it down. So they were watered down considerably, and he knew he had to get that, and he did get that. But in relation to what happened, what was eventually in the agreement was built really on trust, and all the communities, including the Unionists and Nationalists and all, everybody voted for the agreement on the basis that they were hoping and praying and trusting that everyone would deliver on what was agreed. Now, I know there was a little bit of subtle, whatever you call it.
Constructive ambiguity?
Yes, yeah, the ambiguity. And I know that the decommissioning, it may have been difficult for the Republicans to deliver on decommissioning in the way that the Unionists would accept it. But I think, in retrospect, if it could have been tied down a little bit better than just that they would do their best. Because remember, it took how many years after that for the decommissioning to happen, during which time the trust that the unionist community had and the hope that it would work was fading very fast, as Gary had said. So I think that was, I know it was difficult and it was hard to get it resolved, but I just sometimes wonder, would Sinn Féin really have walked out, if they had to make it more clearer, because nobody wanted to walk out. But anyway, that's all water under the bridge, and it's all
we can find out now, Bríd. We can find out now.
It's a bit late now, and I do.
No, we can find out now. The party's former national chairperson's here.
But anyway, I think that was a very, very big problem, particularly for the unionist community and for the proper working of a partnership.
Mitchell.
Well, our minibus and the driver was in the car park, and we would have left. The issue was, at the end of the day, that across the range of issues, there was a modicum of agreement. And, on the basis of being the eternal optimist, you can always build on those kind of levels of agreement. If it takes more time, then you have to take more time. Now, our kind of difficulty was right across the piece, every community had suffered. Every community had their, their relatives, the survivors, who were looking for answers, who were looking for justice, who were looking for repentance, and many of them looking for a whole lot more than that. The issue of finding an agreement that would have satisfied everybody would have defied anybody, including George Mitchell. You know, the reality of it is that you had to kind of get sufficient, that the process, and it was a good word to use and to attach to the whole exercise, it was a process, because people didn't trust each other. You know, Republicans certainly didn't trust the British government, and they didn't trust the Irish government very much more than they trusted the British government. And, you know, there's a long history of involvement and contacts going back into the immediate aftermath of the hunger strikes and forward. The key thing that actually made the process a viable process for Republicans was the Downing Street Declaration from John Major. Bear in mind that his government was held by the throat by Jim Molyneux's unionists. Jim Molyneux, who said the diary ceasefire was the worst news he had heard in his entire political career.
No, I think destabilising.
Destabilising,
yes.
yeah, at the ceasefire. So that kind of mentality actually, is, if you like, a part explanation of why it's so difficult to find agreement. But in my sense of it, we felt that we had sufficiently to go back and to negotiate the agreement that we had made on the basis that we could make further progress through engagement. And our people wanted peace to the extent that they swallowed all of those kind of resentments or recriminations or disappointments that they had, because they weren't overwhelmingly enthusiastic about what they got. They certainly weren't, jumping up and down with joy. But they did, I know, drive around the districts and blare their horns and wave flags and all of that. But the point is that they did accept that significant progress had been made, and that other parties had difficulties as well. And, it was an anachronism, in my view, of organisation that the Ulster Unionist Council could summon the leader within hours and overturn them. I mean, I remember in the ongoing negotiations where we had made some considerable progress, and Tony Blair was going around at 4:30 in the morning, always seemed to be at 4:30, shaking hands with people on his way out to the helicopter. I said, we did a good day's work today, and Jerry Adams said, you should listen to the Radio Ulster News at 8 o'clock in the morning to see whether we still have a deal or not. And of course the news was that the Ulster Unionist Council had been convened. So I had a very strong admiration for not only the resilience and the courage of David Trimble, but his determination. And I suspect that he had a mighty woman supporting him.
Oh, he certainly did. He certainly did. We'll just Monica, I'll come to you in a minute. I just want to tidy up a couple of last things. Peter Weir, do you want to say anything about the Orange Order?
Well, not really specifically about the Orange Order. I think the position was, I think David Trimble's analysis was that he had got sufficient, as he saw, big wins, that the level of opposition within unionism would be simply a level of rump opposition. It would be relatively small. Yeah. It would dissipate very quickly. I mean, can I say, I suppose, two other things just. I think the constructive ambiguity was probably important in helping to reach an agreement, but it was also the thing which then left major problems as time moved on. I think if there was a call it a trick that was missing, I think probably principally from unionist point of view, the biggest weakness within things was that, if you like, the government was too keen to placate those who'd been previously involved in violence. I think as a major terrorist campaign, I think that by 1998 there wasn't really a great deal for Sinn Féin and others. Was there anywhere else that they could really go? And I think, because I think that while violence was always completely morally wrong, by that stage it had been seen to be relatively militarily unsuccessful and politically unsuccessful. So I don't think there was a realistic prospect of fully ever going back. And therefore I would say that probably the biggest trick missed was a direct level of linkage between government, prison releases and decommissioning. And the final point I want to make is people have rightly talked about anger within communities directed towards things. I think it shouldn't also be underestimated at times that for anybody on the unionist side who said, look, we can't accept this as a no, it wasn't always an easy position either, because particularly amongst sometimes commentators and other politicians, the portrayal was that if you put any level of objection to anything, not simply were you opposing what was there, you were against peace itself. There wasn't, to a certain extent, a caricaturing of anybody, and there was very large numbers of people who said, sorry, principally on the unionist side, but also some, I think, at times who...
Well, nearly 30%.
What's
nearly 30%.
Yeah, on that side of a thing. And that contained, obviously, for particular principal reasons, some, even albeit not a very large percentage of people on the nationalist side who, some of whom said, for instance, we just can't accept prisoner releases or whatever type of thing on it. But I think there was a certain amount of stereotyping and caricaturing of people there, that they were simply opposed to peace and opposed to any agreement. And I think, if you like, probably it's maybe not surprising, given a lot of the raw emotion that had been at the end of the Troubles, that there was levels of anger probably on both sides of some of those arguments within communities. It wasn't just all one-sided, I think, in that regard.
Well, that's very clear. I love the idea that I'm holding an orange stick.
I just noticed that, yes. And Peter got the green one.
He's got the green one. Do you know, I think sometimes you have to unpick the word terror. And everybody in every community had a sense of where that was coming from, depending on where you were standing. So it's back to your point about Garvaghey Road. And of course, you have to remember Drumcree had happened during the 2 years of our negotiations, and the place was burning down around us. And so sometimes you have to look back and see if the state could have done a whole lot more at an earlier stage to resolve that. So I'm a great believer now in making sure that you have these commissions that are independent and can mediate. Because there was nobody doing that back in our day until the Bríd Commission came along, and obviously some people still have an issue with that, on both the dissident Republicans and indeed those at that time on the Orange Order side. But I felt, and you're talking, Gary, about the issue of trust and a person's honour and is their word their honour. Had we had better relationships, we might have understood that a person's word was their honour. And I think, looking back now, it was a mistake that David Trimble did not speak to Gerry Adams during the negotiations. And I remember once the ceasefire was in place and they entered the talks, and President Mandela took us, and Tim Phillips is here, and was involved from, at the time it was called Justice in Times of Transition, and now it's called Beyond Conflict. And he gave me this tonight, and since we're in the library, and he's donated this to the library, and it's called Beyond Conflict. And there's a story in that from Ralph Mayer, who did the negotiations with Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa. And we learned a lot in those 3 days in South Africa about how to get beyond conflict. So my point is that Mandela said two things. He said, and Sinn Féin were not in ceasefire at the time, so we more or less had to have two of everything in Mandela. Sinn Féin, no, IRA were not on ceasefire at the time. Thanks for that correction. But
I thought it was my piece at that point.
Mandela said very strongly, you cannot negotiate with a gun at your head, so there needs to be a ceasefire. And I think Martin McGuinness and everybody that was listening to those words, all of us who were there, took it very seriously. I think, and he then said, do not make the guns your number one negotiation point. And I came home thinking, we're going to ruin this process if we make the guns the number one. Let them rust in peace. If a person's word is their honour, and you're in a relationship with that person and you're trying to build a partnership with that person, then don't say that it's a strength not to talk to them. Because to me, that was a weakness, and we paid the price. So you've donated this to this library, and so I'd say all of you sign up and become life members of this library.
I'm not allowed to do advertising, Monica. Look at me done.
And
Turn
Mark,
those cameras off.
Having said it, it is a library, and my book's in it as well.
That's a really good book. The gentleman asked about the future, so I've got one very quick pointed question for you all about the future. Gary McMichael, it's as if we're back 25 years ago. What about a political comeback?
Hey, must be joking. Though I have no interest in politics, I'll come back.
We've learned that tonight.
I
can
go back and look at it in 25 years' time and see if we're still in the same place. I think what the agreement did was it set a kind of a point in time where everything, a benchmark that couldn't be, we can't go back over. So, you know, everything that happened before 1998 is not going to happen again. You know, it's never going to be like that again. It's not conceivable. So, you know, no matter how difficult it is, and all of the problems which are there, and all the concerns that there are, and, you know, if people have concerns, there are legitimate concerns, and we can't ignore those things, but it's okay to have differences. It's okay to have different aspirations and different positions. But as long as we can, you know, do what we did in 1998 and create the conditions where those concerns can be dealt with in an absence of, where there's an absence of violence, and that's the bottom line. But the last thing on that is that, you know, what was being dealt with in 1998 was much more complex than the challenges that are being faced today.
Yeah.
But the price then was maybe higher. And I think that, you know, all of those things that we said, you know, that were kicked down the road and all those problems that were there, you know, the agreement was made on the basis that we would solve all of those through the assembly, because the assembly is where the relationships could continue,
yes,
and people could work all of that out.
Yeah,
and if you don't have that there, then it's very, very difficult to get everybody to move on.
1 minute each, Bríd. You wanted to come in, just because we have to be out at 15:15.
I want to say, John Hume said at the time, we now have the institutions and we have the tools to build a better future and a new Ireland. Those were his very words. And in fact, what happened at St Andrews kind of made that very difficult, because you created a tribal situation. Once Paisley didn't want to have to vote for Martin McGuinness, so they changed the mechanism where the Unionists voted for their own man and the Nationalists voted for their own man or woman, and that immediately created a tribal situation, and that has brought us to what we now have, which is a tribal fight every time there's an election. So in order to work the Good Friday Agreement, we need to have political leadership that is prepared to work the actual spirit of the agreement, which is genuine partnership, laying aside and accepting our differences and working together on so many of the common interests which bind us all together, really, if you look at it. So I think that is the issue. I think we have to look at the changes we made, which have actually stymied the development of a proper, genuine, trusting relationship.
Lord Weir.
Well, I maybe take a slight degree of disagreement on one aspect of that, which is I think we are possibly naive to think that in 1998 that didn't in and of itself create a level of tribal politics. I don't think it was overnight, suddenly in 06, 07 that took place. I remember a friend of mine, actually after the Ulster Unionist Council meeting that was about a week after the agreement, said, well, this now means that there'll be a process which elections are going to be a battle for a certain level of, within each community, of communal advantage. So, I think there's a certain level of myth that suddenly there was this transformative moment at St Andrews which suddenly locked us into a particular process. Can I say, I suppose, really, that in terms of maybe if there's a lesson to be learned across the board, it is that ultimately we always need structures where there can be confidence in all communities for those structures, and that's the only thing that ultimately will work. I think where I would maybe find common cause with a number of the panellists is to say that while there are difficulties there today and there are major things that still need to be resolved, probably where we are in society, the level of those difficulties are an awful lot less than what society as a whole faced in 1998. And despite the imperfections, we are in a safer society than we were in 1998. And I think that's something which I think, at least I think we can gain something out of.
Thank you. Monica Williams, and then finish with you, Mr. Speaker.
Two regrets, and I see Pádraig O'Malley sitting here. And one is that Pádraig organised that trip to South Africa and brought us on retreats. Retreat is something in this country that we think you go and pray. But there it was a quiet place where we sat, if any of us that were here will remember, where finally we were able to engage in a dialogue. In all our crises, we were still able to do that, and we did it outside the country. So I regret that we don't have more of those outside of the plenary and outside of the combative nature of mainstream politics, that there aren't opportunities today and back then to engage in that kind of honest dialogue. So Mark, I thank you for that and for the work that you've done. My biggest regret, you'll be surprised to hear this because not much is said about it. We had two things that finally Senator Mitchell said we could put on the table. Everybody had one that they could call their stamp. And we pulled one of them, and perhaps we should have kept it. And maybe the Civic Forum would have taken off anyway. It was electoral reform.
Okay.
And we asked for the Scottish system, where half of the members of the Scottish Parliament are made up from the country on a list, and the other half come from constituencies. And my problem today is that too many people are focused and combative inside their constituencies and not thinking enough about the entire country. And we didn't get enough support, I have to say, from the bigger parties, because after an agreement is signed and even coming up to it, there's a nostalgia for the status quo. There's a nostalgia for going back to what you know best. And we had an opportunity to do something different. And I have to say, if the Women's Coalition went back, we probably should have insisted on electoral reform.
Interesting. Thank you, Monica. Final word, Mitchel McLaughlin.
Yeah, well, I mean, my perspective is that, sectarianism or tribalism was baked into the politics of this place at the time of partition. And that begs the obvious solution to that kind of outcome. In my experience, and I'm 77 years of age, and I've been, involved in politics for a very significant period of that lifetime, is that, there are opportunities that come once in a while to kind of, develop better understanding of the other. But the North has created a set of circumstances where that is a real challenge, and perhaps the insights in themselves or the relationships that you can develop are insufficient to kind of create any momentum for change or sustained change. But I do think that we're actually at a tipping point now in terms of, say, the constitutional future. And I think that, that will bring its own dynamics and challenges, and will certainly put the agreement under stress yet again. But I do think that, that kind of impact of partition really needs to be examined from the perspective of our future generations. There's a community which lives south of the border. In 1921, we're told that they would have to kind of stay there to create a numerical advantage for unionism, and that was the a mistake that was made at that time, in my view. But the point I would make for the here and now, or for the immediate future, is that conversation with that community may well dispel some of the concerns that people would have, because they have lived within the context of the 26 counties on the southern side of the partitionist line, and they have survived. They have not been discriminated against. They have prospered, and they have a story to tell that I think the unionist community and the British tradition in Ireland have to know and understand and own.
Mitchell, thank you. Thank you to Bríd. Thank you to Lord Weir, to Monica and to Gary. Thank you. Thank you. Folks, I'm sorry we didn't get more questions. I have heard stories tonight I've never heard before, and that's why we should keep this going. So Lennon Hall, let's come again in 30 years, not 30 years' time, in 5 years' time. Can you indulge me for 1 minute? Because everybody's told us a story that's never been told before. I think everybody's told one. My one is 2 years, maybe 3 years after the Good Friday Agreement, Weston Park talks. Who was there? Were you there, Mitchell? Bríd was there. Monica was there. Gary, you were trying to make money at that stage. Anyway, Stormont had broken down. You'd be shocked to hear that. And they went to Weston Park in Staffordshire, and again, hothouse talks. There was a journalist blackout, a media blackout, and all the politicians left without talking to the media. So we had to report on the news last night without any news conferences, without any sound bites. We're all wondering, what's the story here? Anybody got in the inside track? You're phoning all the mobile numbers of all the key players. Nobody's answering. You're going to voicemail. You're texting. Nobody's texting back. And I'm in the media scrum. I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil your video here. I'm in the media scrum, and I look at my phone, Bríd Rodgers. I'm going, right. Do you know what's coming here, Bríd? No? I'm going, oh, I'm down to go to the loo here. So I break away from the media pack. Bríd, Mark, are you still in the talks? Yeah. We're on the flight on the way home. I said, I know, you all went out without talking to us. What do you want, Bríd? What can you tell me? She said, I left my book behind. Could you bring it home for me? Do you remember that? So that was my big scoop. Stephen Grimison broke the agreement. I got Bríd Rodgers' book. Listen, thank you very much indeed. Safe home, everyone. And there's another debate next week. Thank you.